This is a review of the highlights of Chapter 3. It goes into, again, the ideas of opportunity cost and relative price, and some additional assumptions of the classical model. These are useful for understanding the basis from which we can make the conclusions. The chief description of why countries trade is given by Adam Smith as absolute advantage. And basically it's saying that they're more productive. Under competitive market assumptions, fewer inputs are needed, means the lower cost to produce the product. They're more productive than the other country. And the tables are used to give you the two products, the two countries, and the amount of labor needed. Anyone who took my course as an undergraduate in international trade, please note this table has a different arrangement. This is the amount of labor needed to produce one unit. Previously, in the other course, we saw how many units one labor would produce. So you have to stick with this version to answer the questions correctly. And what it does is it shows you that if they use less labor to produce it, they have the absolute advantage. Therefore, they're going to have the lower opportunity cost and be able to produce the product at an advantage. And the two countries will find they'd be better off if they're able to let the better producer produce that good and then trade accordingly. You can read through this and get some of this sense. The comparative advantage, which was introduced by David Ricardo, is more important. It's the aspect that we use. And in this case, he's saying, what if one country has absolute advantage in both goods? And that would mean they shouldn't trade according to Smith's approach. So what he says is that it's more important to look or compare the opportunity cost instead of the absolute cost, and then be able to decide who has the lower opportunity cost, and then use that for your comparative advantage. And the example he gives shows that in this case, country A has the comparative absolute advantage in both goods because they use less labor to produce both goods. But then he goes on to show that they will consider the opportunity cost, which we're going to be able to use in this case, is going to turn out, because of the assumptions, also the relative price. And that's why we're able to use the price, the P numbers here, or values in your ratio. But if you look at this, it says that by comparing for country A whether they should produce product soybean or product textiles, to produce one more pound of soybeans cost them a half a yard of textiles. To produce in country B, one more pound of soybeans cost 1.5 yards of textiles. Since 0.5 is less than 1.5, country A is going to have the comparative lower opportunity cost of soybeans and therefore the comparative advantage. Looking at the other good, and even before we got to this slide, you should have figured out that the other country is going to have the comparative advantage in the other good, but here's the numerical representation of that. Just to note, one country could have absolute advantage in both goods, but only comparative advantage in one of the goods. And here goes into a little more explanation of why we call it comparative advantage, and this shows you why there's a gain from trade. Graphically, this is intended to show the same concept. So we have two countries, two goods. These are their production. Their production is different. They could use the same techniques, but it's a different production situation in the two countries. Working through that, we come up with the same concepts, but here we're using the slope to calculate the opportunity cost of 1 unit of soybeans in terms of textiles in the two countries and 1 unit of textiles in terms of soybeans in the two countries. And again, we find the same conclusion we found in the table. Once you have established that, and then again, that is going to be based on the slope of the production possibility frontier and the one over the slope of the production possibility frontier for the other good, we can talk about autarky, equilibrium, and then the introduction of trade. Autarky equilibrium is going to be somewhere on the production possibility frontier, and that somewhere is going to be where ACIC is tangent to that. In this figure from the textbook, it only includes one CIC. You should assume that there are others. This is the one that's tangent. That gives us the equilibrium. It also tells us what relative prices are going to be because demand matches up with supply. And in fact, in this situation, the quantities produced and the quantities supplied will be identical. As we go through this information, it is going to give us, as we saw before, comparative advantage, and therefore we should expect the two countries will go through production. In Ricardo, in the classical model, because we're going to have this constant production possibility frontier, meaning a straight line, each country will completely specialize in the good they have a comparative advantage. So we saw country A had a comparative advantage in soybeans. It will produce only soybeans when it decides to participate in trade. Country B will produce only textiles when it decides to participate in trade because it has the comparative advantage. This concept of terms of trade is the idea that the prices will now depend on consumers' demand combined for both countries. And the production will be the supply for both countries. Now, in this case, the production will be from one country, but that will be the world production of the product. And the terms of trade will be the price or relative price that the world will settle on given supply, demand, and indifference curves, meaning their satisfaction levels. So you should read through that and try to understand where the TOT line comes from. But in the drawings, it's basically arbitrary. It just exists. And we throw it in there. There's a discussion in the chapters about how it has to be so that the price of soybeans will be somewhere between the country with the comparative advantage and the other country, but not a clear definition of where it comes from exactly, except through market forces settling on this price, and then it will be the price in both countries. So the TT line in both graphs, the blue line here, is going to have the same slope in either country. What will be different is the starting point and therefore the different combinations, but the slopes of the two lines will be the same line. And that's what we've added here. In other textbooks, other opportunities, it's also referred to the trade possibility line. If you want to look at this graph, you could think of this line is the production possibility frontier. That is the combinations, all the possible combinations this country can efficiently produce. The terms of trade is going to be all the combinations they can consume when they trade, based on the idea that they completely specialize here in soybeans at this point, and then they export some of the soybeans and buy some textiles with that exports. And therefore, that process goes through the whole line, and they can trade their soybeans for any of the combinations and pick up textiles, therefore getting all these combinations. Couple things. One, production is always on the production possibility frontier, even though it's with trade. So this point or that point it's going to be where they completely specialize, which is where they have comparative advantage. You'll know where that point is from just one graph because that's where the trade possibility line will start from. So just looking at this graph, if you didn't read anything else, you would know that country A has a comparative advantage in soybeans. If there was international trade, they would completely specialize in that product and produce this amount, and then they would use this line to represent what combinations they would consume as a result of exporting some soybeans and importing some textiles. The point on the line, which they will choose as a country, will be the one that gives them the most satisfaction. And again, you could have indifference curves, many of them, some of them cutting the TT line, the one we had back here, which was tangent to the production possibility frontier, but this one is going to be the highest possible for what they can do. Again, sticking with this graph, this was our point with production in autarky that basically goes away. It's not of relevance anymore. What's now in terms of trade is going to be where they produce, which is here where the PPF and the TT line are together, and here where they consume, which is where the TT line, TOT line, and an indifference curve are tangent. And this just tells you the same story for the other country, and you should be able to recognize that as you go through the process. In this case, you can use these letters to represent the combinations, and this line segment represents the exports. So what we saw before, it was J, and they consumed at I. Here it's point E is where they're producing, point F is where they're consuming. That must mean they export the combinations, the soybeans represented by the line segment AG, and this means they import the textiles represented by the line segment FH or HF. It doesn't matter which way you describe it. The chief description here about gains from trade is going to be that they produce above the production possibility frontier, meaning that they can consume a combination they can't produce on their own. They must participate in international trade to be able to produce above the production possibility frontier. To consume above the production possibility frontier. This talks a little bit about how it also gives us a production gain because in the process of allocating our resources as a world, meaning the two countries combined, it's going to be using the least amount of resources, in this case labor, to produce the amount of output the whole world is going to consume. And then this reciprocal demand story is just that the idea here is that exports will equal imports as you move along, and you can identify that in the graph. That's basically the information from that slide.